Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel for another midweek mystery video, where this week we're talking about the Jamison family. Now the Jamison family consisted of 44-year-old Bobby, his wife 40-year-old Sherilyn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison, and the three lived in Eufaula, Oklahoma. I think from the outside they would have appeared to have been quite a normal family, but a closer look reveals a very strange story. And then on the 8th of October 2009, the family disappear. After a few days, there's a report to say that their truck has been found on the side of a road in Latimer County in the mountains, which is about an hour's drive away from the Jamisons' home. And that was kind of it. The police arrive at the scene, they go looking for the family, and they don't find them until 4 years later. Their bodies, just skeletons at this point, were found just 3 miles away from where the pickup truck was found. And honestly guys, you need to get ready for this case because this is an absolute rabbit hole. So Sherilyn and Bobby met in 2002 and Madison came shortly after in August 2003. And the next year, in July 2004, the couple ended up marrying in Hot Springs, Arizona. Together, the family lived in a home in Eufaula, Oklahoma, which was a city with a really small population of under 3,000 people at the time. They appeared to live a very normal life, but just scratch below the surface and you find all sorts of strange going-ons. You see, when the family first began, they seemed to live very happily, but things started to unravel pretty quickly. Bobby gets into a car accident. I couldn't find an exact date, but I think it was around 2004, which ends up leaving him with chronic back pain. He found it really difficult to work. He couldn't even get out of bed some mornings. He couldn't walk from place to place. And this meant that his only way of making money was from the state, receiving welfare benefits. He was in a lot of pain constantly with his back, and he took legal action suing the 3 other people involved in the car accident, but I couldn't find out if this actually came to anything. And as far as I could find, welfare benefits were also Sherilyn's only income as well. She was on welfare herself due to some pretty severe mental health issues. She suffered with severe depression and very bad bipolar disorder, which left her unable to work. From what I could gather, Sherilyn had suffered with her mental health for a really long time, but her struggle was just intensified when her younger sister actually died in 2007 after a freak accident. She was stung on the tongue by a bee, had an allergic reaction, and ended up dying. And this is going to mess up anyone's mental state. Anybody's going to grieve about this. But with Sherilyn's history already of depression and bipolar, she just really seemed to go off the rails a little bit. Friends and family of Sherilyn knew that she was quite bad at taking her medication at the best of times. She sort of got into this cycle, which you see quite a lot with people who suffer with depression, that you take your tablets and you feel better because you're taking your tablets, and so then you stop taking them because why do you want to take them when you're feeling good? And then you just get worse again, and then the cycle just continues. And this was kind of the cycle that Sherilyn was on. Sherilyn also had another son, Colton, from a previous marriage, and he was 12 years old. And he'd actually lived with Sherilyn, Bobby and Madison in Eufaula until pretty recently, until he reconnected with his dad. And he decides that he wants to go and live with his dad. I think his dad lived sort of like in one of the bigger cities nearby. There was a custody hearing, but Colton was 12 years old. He was old enough now to sort of decide that he wanted to go live with his dad. We don't know 100% why he decided to live with his dad. I think just because he wanted to be in a bigger city. He'd never really been that close with his dad, and now they were suddenly close and he wanted to connect with him. And so Colton goes off to live with his dad, and again, this wouldn't have been good for Sherilyn. Colton actually said at the custody hearing that his mum was very depressed and that she acted strangely sometimes. And around this same time as well, the parents decide to take Madison out of school and they plan to homeschool her. Again, I'm not 100% sure what happened here. I think there was an accident at school which led to Madison losing some of her teeth, and the parents decided for Madison's safety to drag her out of school. They actually threatened legal action against the school as well, but I don't, again, think this amounted to anything. But with Madison not being in school, obviously when the family disappeared, the school weren't any the wiser that Madison had gone off the radar because she wasn't supposed to be there anyway. Alongside this as well, Sherilyn and Bobby had a friend called Kenneth Bellows. Now Kenneth had actually recently moved into the Jamison home to help out with maintenance. It was a large property with quite a large garden. Obviously Sherilyn had her mental health problems, Bobby had his really bad back pain, so he couldn't maintain the property in the way that he would have liked to have done. So Kenneth became the family's live-in handyman, maintenance man. But shortly after Colton decided to move out to live with his dad, the family's relationship with Kenneth turned very sour. So Sherilyn claimed to have Native American sort of ancestry, and this was something she was pretty proud of, but it turns out that Kenneth, massive racist. He's a self-proclaimed white supremacist, and when he hears that Sherilyn has this Native American ancestry, he tells her that she is better off dead. And obviously this leads to an argument, a fight between the two, and Sherilyn actually ends up getting her .22 caliber pistol and she shoots it at the ground by Kenneth's feet, and she obviously kicks Kenneth out. I bring this up not because Kenneth is necessarily a suspect in the family's disappearance, because it actually turns out that he was in jail at the time they disappeared, so it literally couldn't have been him. But I am mentioning this because it's just another layer, another weird thing that happened to this family before they disappeared. As you can probably tell, there was a lot going on with the Jamison family in the months leading up to their disappearance, but honestly at this point I've barely scratched the surface. Obviously after the family disappeared, the police turn up at their home to sort of have a look, see if there's any clues there, and they find again a very strange sight. So at the front of the house there was this large storage container, and on this storage container there was some very creepy messages sort of like graffitied. One of these messages read, "3 cats killed to date by people in this area. Witches don't like their black cats killed." And a friend of Sherilyn's actually came forward. She was called Nikki. She becomes like quite involved in this case. She comes forward and says to the police that apparently a neighbour of Sherilyn's, a neighbour of the Jamisons, had been killing their cats, or so Sherilyn thought. And Sherilyn had written the message to scare them off because she thought of herself as a bit of a witch. And this wasn't the only weird graffiti. There was more graffiti on the storage container. There was sort of like random messages written throughout the house, which I'll talk about in a little bit. And this is particularly strange because near where the Jamisons' truck was found, there was actually an abandoned wreck of a vehicle in the mountain. And this vehicle was something that would be used for target practice, for hunters, for shooting. And there were satanic messages written all over this abandoned vehicle. And over the top of these satanic messages, there had been other messages written, graffitied, things that said, "God love you" and "peace." And Nikki insists that these writings, this graffiti, is in Sherilyn's handwriting. Like I mentioned, Sherilyn had an interest in witches and Wicca. She often referred to herself as a witch. She owned a witch's Bible, as Nikki called it. Her friends and family have differing opinions as to whether Sherilyn actually 100% thought of herself as a witch, if she 100% followed the Wicca religion. Some people say it was just tongue-in-cheek. Nikki insists that she was pretty serious about it. But regardless, there's no denying that Sherilyn definitely had an interest in this, whether she was fully practicing or not. And then the family's pastor, Gary Brandon, comes forward and he gives a shocking statement to the police. He says that the family had been involved in spiritual warfare, with both Bobby and Sherilyn on occasion telling him that they'd both seen spirits in their home. Sherilyn said the spirits of a long dead family lived with them, and that Madison spoke with the children of this family. They were called Michael and Emily. From what I can gather, Sherilyn didn't seem overly bothered by it, maybe as part of her interest in Wicca, this kind of supernatural thing didn't necessarily bother her too much. But Bobby hated it. Bobby was really, really bothered by it. It made him really uncomfortable. The family weren't sure if these spirits were malicious or not, whether they're out to hurt them or they were just spirits. So Bobby goes out and buys a satanic Bible, and he wants to exorcise the spirits himself. And he also goes to Pastor Brandon and asks him if there's special bullets he can buy to shoot and kill the spirits. Nikki backs up the family's claims, saying she'd experienced these spirits herself. She said she felt a horrible presence whenever she was at the home, and apparently once she saw a grey mist descend down the stairs, and that Bobby would on occasion become possessed by these spirits, his eyes turning black. Apparently Sherilyn would write notes and leave them around the house saying things like "get out Satan," and she had begun to look into the background of the property, wondering if it was an ancient Native American burial site. I don't know if she found out if it was or not, but yeah, Nikki says 100% that she believed the claims that the house was involved in this spiritual warfare. I am not convinced. I don't really believe in stuff like that, but if you believe in it, then that's up for you to decide. And then on the 8th of October 2009, the three of them pack up the white pickup truck that they owned and they drive out of Eufaula to Red Oak, which is in Latimer County, about 30 miles south of where they lived. It's sort of like in the mountains, and they basically headed off to look at a plot of land that they'd found online. And they intended to move into this plot of land in their large storage container, and that was it. They were going to just move off the grid. And this was the storage container I mentioned previously, the large storage container in front of the house covered in Sherilyn's graffiti. I don't know how I feel about their idea of moving their 6-year-old child into this storage container in the middle of the mountains. A little bit weird. Maybe they did eventually plan on like building a house there. But they went to the mountains under the pretense of looking at this plot of land. Some sources say this plot of land was as big as 40 acres. The family, I think you probably gathered by this point, are fairly kooky, quirky, a little bit hippie. The idea of living off the grid with Madison and their dog Maisie probably would have quite appealed to them. They probably wanted to get out of their haunted house and like feel safer in the mountains. But strangely enough, the family never mentioned any plans to move to their son Colton, who had literally only moved out of the house like a month and a half earlier. So that's a little bit strange. It seems to be quite sort of like a sudden decision. The land they were looking at was located at the base of the Santa Boyce Mountains, which is where they headed, and it does seem that they did indeed meet the landowner, the person who owned this land. But from there on, their movements are kind of like pieced together like a puzzle. We can't be 100% sure. All I think we know for sure is that they did meet this landowner. But honestly, I'm not even 100% convinced by that. I saw that in a couple of articles, but other articles made no mention of them actually meeting him. So it's a little bit strange. So the Jamisons were known by friends and family for often just packing up and disappearing for a few days. They'd take Madison, take their dog, and just go off the grid. It was something they did quite often, and so when they kind of disappeared, nobody thought anything of it. They just thought they'd gone off on another one of their adventures. This until a few days later when a biker calls the police to say they basically found this abandoned pickup truck on the side of the road. And several officers head up to the mountains to the truck to investigate. They just assume that it's abandoned, it's been stolen. But when they get there, they find it locked, and a lot of people say that it looked like it had been run off the road. I can only find one photo of the truck, but it doesn't look like to me that it's been run off the road. It just looks like it's kind of been parked there. So I don't know exactly why some people say this. But the first thing the police notice when they get there is that there's a dog inside the truck. The family's dog Maisie is still in there, and at this point it's 8 days later, so you can imagine that she's in a really bad way. So the police make the decision to smash the window to get Maisie out. She was emaciated, she hadn't eaten or drank anything for 8 days apart from her own feces and urine, but she was just about still alive. But this was the first clue that something was amiss. Who would lock their dog in a car and then walk away, just leaving it to starve to death? For those that are interested though, Maisie did survive and she went on to be adopted by a family member and she was absolutely fine. But the dog, as you can probably guess, wasn't the only strange thing that they found in the truck. They found all of the family's warm clothes, all of their coats had been left behind, as well as Sherilyn and Bobby's bag and wallet. As well as this, they found a GPS unit, which is a pretty vital thing to take with you if you decide to go for a walk in the mountains, because it obviously stops you from getting lost. And they found both the couple's phones. If you're going for a walk in the wilderness and you're going to take these things with you, especially the clothes as well, taking your coat with you. This was October and the mountains can get pretty chilly, so you want to take a coat. And alongside these things, they find an 11-page letter written by Sherilyn to Bobby expressing her hatred for her husband. Now this letter isn't available online, so I can't tell you for certain what it says. I can't tell you if the contents has just been exaggerated over time by all these different people writing articles on this case. But apparently the police said it was just a very sort of like angry letter from Sherilyn to her husband. As you'll come to see, a lot of weight is placed on this letter, but honestly there's no date on the letter. It wasn't dated, so they don't know if it was written years earlier, they don't know if it was written days earlier, hours earlier. There's no way of knowing. I mean, this may have just been a way that Sherilyn would get her emotions out. I know that a lot of therapists suggest, like, if you're particularly emotional, write a letter. You don't have to send it, but just write it down, get your emotions out onto paper. Could this be what Sherilyn was doing? Did she ever intend for Bobby to see it? Did Bobby ever see it? We won't know. I'd be interested to read the letter if it's ever made public. I mean, I believe the police when they say it was an angry letter, like expressing hatred for her husband, but it's hard to use it as any like significant evidence in this particular video when I can't tell you exactly what it says. And on top of everything else, all the weird things they found in the truck, they also find $32,000 in cash stuffed underneath the passenger seat of the truck, and this was like properly stuffed in there. It was really well hidden, and it was actually wrapped in 2 different bags. And as you can imagine, there are so many questions surrounding this money, but nobody seemed to be able to give any explanation as to how the family came to have this much cash. Would 2 people who are feeding their family solely on disability benefits, it seems, really be able to save that much money? I mean, of course, I'm sure it's possible, but it seems more unlikely than likely. And why would they have the money in cash instead of in a bank account? I mean, I suppose if they have that money in a bank account, then they're going to stop getting their benefits. I just haven't really been able to find much information in regards to the family's bank account at all. If they had any bank account, if they had any money in the account, or if they'd recently made a big withdrawal. I can't tell you that information. I mean, I'd be inclined to think that they hadn't ever had this money in a bank account because it probably would have meant they wouldn't receive as much in benefits. And they'd just been like slowly squirreling this cash away. But we'll never really know. And why did they have so much cash on them that day? Maybe they were intending to buy the land in cash and for whatever reason didn't. According to Sherilyn's mother, Connie, the family were really struggling financially. Like, this was something that Sherilyn and Bobby were both really worried about. They didn't know how they were going to raise their daughter just on these benefits. Neither of them were in a fit state to work. And why would they be panicking so much about that if they had $32,000 in cash hidden away? They found no signs of a struggle, no blood, nothing broken. There was no signs of like a scruffle in the dirt around the car. It seemed like the family had simply just left the car, sort of like parked it on the side of the road and decided to go for a walk. But if this was the case, why would they not take the dog with them? Like, why leave the dog in the car when you could just go for a walk with the dog? A huge search operation was organised, which would actually end up lasting for quite a few weeks. There were 16 different teams of cadaver dogs, there were horses, drones, a huge team of investigators. At first the police wouldn't let the public volunteer for help because they didn't want to like lead to any more deaths because it was a very easy area to get lost in. But eventually the police did allow the public to help as well. So there were so many people searching. The cadaver dogs repeatedly led investigators to this nearby water tower. So of course everyone was like, yep, the bodies are in there, they're in there for some reason. So they drowned the water tower and there was literally nothing in there. But this was like multiple different dogs on different teams who all alerted them to this water tower, which is a little bit strange. I don't think there's any denying the police did a really good job in this case. They did everything they possibly could do. The sheriff like really did everything he could in this case. He ended up resigning shortly after, I think. But some cases, you just, no matter what you do, they're destined to remain unsolved, and this seems to be one of those cases. To this point, obviously, with the discovery of the truck, everyone's searching for the family, the police head to the Jamisons' house to sort of see what they can find. I've already mentioned all the weird graffiti, all the witchcraft stuff, but they also find something else incredibly vital to this investigation. The family had basically installed CCTV on their property, I think maybe earlier that year, the year before, because they'd had a fallout with Bobby's father, Bobby Sr., which I will talk about in more detail in a little bit, but just bear with me here. The CCTV footage shows the Jamisons, Bobby and Sherilyn, walking back and forth from the truck, packing it. And this is the morning just before they set off on the 8th of October. They're walking back and forth, loading it. Sometimes one of them would like put an item in the truck and the other one would then take it out. They seem to be in like a really trance-like state. They're not talking or communicating in any way. They're just like literally just walking back and forth, packing it with all this stuff. But this was great for the police because it meant they were able to cross-reference and check everything that should have been in the truck. They were having a look to see like, okay, the Jamisons put this in the truck and yet we found this. But there was one thing they saw them put in the truck that was never found. They see the Jamisons pack a large brown briefcase into the truck, but this wasn't found in the truck or anywhere near it. It just disappeared and it's never been found to this day, and the contents of this briefcase remains a mystery. They also know that Sherilyn owned a .22 caliber pistol, the same pistol she shot at Kenneth Bellows a couple of months before, but this pistol couldn't be found anywhere in the home. Friends and family said that Sherilyn would usually keep the pistol in the truck, but it couldn't be found in the truck either. And again, this has never been found. I really hope you guys are able to keep up with this case. I know there's so many different twists and turns, but it's just so interesting. So obviously the police look into the mobile phones found in the truck, and on Bobby's phone they find a really recent photo of Madison, and that photo of Madison was taken that day on the 8th of October 2009. They cross-checked the phone and the GPS unit, and they eventually discovered that this photo was taken about 600 feet away from where the truck was parked. It seems that at some point on this trip the family had left the car to perhaps go for a walk, and Bobby snapped a photo of Madison on his phone before returning to the truck, putting the phones and the GPS unit back in the truck, locking it and the dog inside, and then just walking away again for some reason. And people have a lot of thoughts about this photo of Madison. The family said that it was unlike the usual photos they take of their daughter. They usually took very like staged, posed photos of Madison, but this was just a random candid. But of course, all you know is what a family shares. All the family possibly shared with friends and families were the posed, proper photos of their daughter. Maybe they took a lot of candids, but never really shared them. A lot of people think it looks like Madison is having some kind of tantrum in the photo, which for a 6-year-old girl really isn't out of the ordinary. Like, it's pretty normal for a kid to have a tantrum. The strange thing is, why would Bobby take a photo of it? I don't particularly think it looks like she's having a tantrum. Like, she's got her arms crossed, she's got her mouth open, but she could have just been speaking. It could have been something as simple as that. But personally, I think it was probably just a badly timed photo, and people place so much weight on this, thinking it's a huge clue in the disappearance of the family. Of course, it could be a huge clue, but I personally don't think there's much weight in the photo itself. But I think it is odd that this photo was taken on the day before they disappeared, and the phone was then returned to the car. I think that's the strange thing in this, not the photo itself. The police do everything they can to find this family, but all the searches end in vain, and all of the evidence just points to this very tangled web of all these different stories. It's really, really strange, but eventually the case just goes quiet. The police can't untangle the web, and there's no new leads for many, many years. Until November 26th, 2013, over 4 years after the disappearance. 3 bodies were discovered by a deer hunter in Panola Mountain, which was 2.7 miles away from where the truck was found, which is fairly close by considering like the vastness of the mountains. The bodies were all lying face down. It was obviously the bodies of 2 adults and a child. They were all lying side by side, and it was miles from any sort of paved road or any sort of like path. It was a really, really remote area. As you would probably guess, the bodies were very severely decomposed after 4 years in the wilderness. They were completely skeletonized. The remains left were just 3 skulls and a jumble of bones and bone fragments, alongside the shoes and I think some random scraps of clothing as well. Of course, it was pretty much immediately assumed that they'd found the bodies of the Jamison family, but it took until July of the next year to confirm this to be true. I really don't know why the DNA testing took so long. I don't know why it took them so long to decide that it was the family. If you sort of like know things about that, then let me know. Why would it take so long to sort of like DNA test these bones and bone fragments? But now the police were under scrutiny. Why had they not found the body sooner or in their initial searches? The hunter who discovered the bodies said that they were lying just pretty much out in the open, like he just stumbled across them and knew immediately that it was human remains. It was barely obscured by the woodland, but this was the thick wilderness, and humans aren't really perfect. It's very likely that they were just missed during the initial searches, obscured by falling leaves. It was the autumn after all. A lot of people do suspect that the bodies were placed there at a later date, which is how they were missed in all of these searches. But from how the bodies were found, this is deemed fairly unlikely. It seems they were there the entire time. This was like miles from any path. Although it was pretty close to the truck, it was still like the middle of the mountains, the middle of the wilderness. And humans make errors. Due to the level of decomposition, it was pretty much impossible to determine any cause of death. Bobby's skull did have a small hole at the base, which was initially thought to be a bullet wound, but they determined later that it wasn't. This wasn't how he died. Obviously, as the bodies were lying out in the mountains for a number of years, they were completely at the mercy to any animals that would have caused probably a significant amount of damage to the bodies. So we have no cause of death whatsoever. The sheriff did say that he suspected foul play to be involved, which is not really a surprise to anybody. And Sherilyn's gun, which wasn't in the truck or in the house, they kind of expected to find it near where the bodies were found. They thought they could have all the answers in this. But the gun has never been found, and neither has the brown briefcase. And now we're going to start on the theories. And honestly, there's no way to completely discount or agree with any of these theories. There are just so many crazy variables in this case that none of these theories completely match. But we're going to start with the most obvious theory in this case, and that is murder. And we're going to talk about the situation with Bobby's father, Bobby Sr., which is something I hinted at earlier when I mentioned the CCTV at the Jamison's property. So Bobby Sr. was a suspect for a very short amount of time in this case, but he died naturally in a care home a couple of months after the family's deaths. He was very ill. He'd been in a care home for a very long time. He just wasn't in any position to be killing anyone. Bobby Jr. and Bobby Sr. had a very strained relationship. Like, they did not get on, and it kind of all stemmed from Bobby Sr.'s divorce from his wife, Bobby's mother. They didn't get on so much to the point there were actually like physical fights. Bobby Sr. tried to run his son over in his car on more than one occasion. It was a very bad situation. This led to Bobby and other members of the Jamison family as well going to court to try and take out a protective order against Bobby Sr. And Bobby actually stated in court that my entire family is scared for their lives. I'm in fear at all times. Bobby claimed in court that his father was involved in prostitution, crystal meth, which there was a big problem with in Eufaula at the time, and the Mexican mafia as well. I couldn't find much basis in these claims. I couldn't find anything to suggest that Bobby Sr. was involved in these things, but regardless, they were claims nonetheless. The relationship was so strained that Bobby Sr. actually wrote Bobby out of his will entirely and left his entire estate to Madison, who I'm pretty sure was his only grandchild. As you can imagine, this just led to further dispute. Bobby Sr. owned a gas station that Bobby was actually a part owner of, only Bobby never received his shares, leading him to file a lawsuit against his father in pursuit of this money that he was owed. Now, I actually read one source that said Bobby was successful in his lawsuit and was actually given $32,000, which could possibly be the $32,000 found in his car. Although why he had it in cash is still a mystery, because in a proper lawsuit it wouldn't just be given in cash, I don't think. I think it would probably have to go through like the more legal avenues such as like bank accounts. But I'm not entirely sure when he would have been rewarded this money. But the facts are definitely a little bit iffy around this. Some sources say it was $32,000, other sources say that it was $10,000, other sources say that he was supposed to be given this money but he was never actually given it. So I can't say for certain that the cash found in the truck was the cash from this lawsuit. It's all a bit funny. If you know more about this, then please let me know. I just couldn't really seem to make these facts like piece together. So the theory leading on from this is that the entire family was murdered by Bobby Sr., which in the end was deemed pretty unlikely due to the fact that he was in a nursing home and like on his deathbed. The potential link to the Mexican mafia also leads to theories that the mafia could have potentially been involved, being paid by Bobby Sr. to do this. But again, this link is very loose and there's literally no evidence to support it. I would perhaps be more inclined to believe the whole Bobby Sr. theory if it was just Bobby that died. He clearly tried to kill him before by running him over with his car. Like, this wasn't a happy family. But it makes very little sense that he would want to kill Madison, his only granddaughter, the granddaughter to whom he was leaving his entire estate. Why would you want to kill this kid? Like, that just doesn't make sense. And also, it's one thing killing an adult, it's a whole other thing killing an innocent child. Like I mentioned before, Kenneth Bellows, the white supremacist, was also looked at as a potential suspect, but he was in jail, so it couldn't have been him. But one big question surrounds the general theory that they were murdered, and that is that it seems like the family left the truck of their own accord. There was no signs of any kind of struggle at the scene. It was locked behind them. Why would they go to the effort of sort of like leaving the truck and locking it if they're being forced away by somebody who's about to murder them? Like, it just doesn't add up. It may seem like a small detail in this, but it's really significant to me anyway that the truck was actually locked behind them. And it wasn't the kind of truck that would just automatically lock either, like they would have had to have locked it. The brown briefcase and the gun were also missing. I'm sure it makes sense they would probably take the gun with them in this kind of scenario, but why would they take a random briefcase with them as well? And if they were murdered, why would the perpetrator not go to the effort of looking through their truck as well? You've just murdered a load of people, so I'm sure going through the truck and stealing what you can isn't going to be the end of the world for you. I believe that a random person, if this was just like a random murder, probably would have gone back to the truck and looked through it. But somebody who potentially followed them up into the mountains for the sole purpose of murdering them probably wouldn't do that. As you'll come to find out, every single theory in this case has its pros and has its cons. A pro in this case is how all the bodies were found, all lying side by side, face down, with a potential bullet hole in the back of Bobby's skull, as if they had all been lined up and shot execution style. But bar the father having something to do with it, what could possibly be the motive for such a murder? I mean, there's a theory that involves trespass, that the family had trespassed onto someone's land and so they got murdered for it. But I'm pretty sure if this was the case, the police would have been able to trace it back pretty quickly. I mean, just have a look at who owned the land in the area. Yeah, I don't really get the trespass theory. A lot of people mention it, but I don't really think there's much in it. Another theory is that they were accidentally murdered by a hunter who was potentially shooting in the area. Hunting season had just begun. If one got accidentally shot and killed, the hunter would be trying to cover their tracks by shooting and killing the rest, before dragging the body somewhere and lightly burying them. And then this hunter just got lucky that the bodies were never found in the initial searches. It's a possibility. Again, it doesn't quite sit right. I reckon if they were murdered, it was by somebody who had followed them up to the mountains with the sole purpose of murdering them. The motive behind this, I don't have a clue. And with that, we'll move on to the next theory, which is drugs. A lot of people suspect that drugs were involved in this case, particularly crystal meth, which Eufaula had a huge problem with at the time. People speculate that the Jamisons took meth themselves. They appeared pretty emaciated. They were both incredibly skinny, which I think they were just skinny people anyway. Even photos of them when they were younger, they're both pretty skinny. But I'm sure with Sherilyn having all of her mental health problems and Bobby being like pretty ill with his back pain, they probably would have lost quite a lot of weight anyway, regardless of whether there were drugs involved or not. The CCTV footage also shows them in this trance-like state, just walking back and forth, which some put down to drug use. Drugs are really not my area of expertise. I know very little about drugs, but from a quick Google search I see that crystal meth is actually a stimulant, which would make you sort of like more hyperactive. It wouldn't make you in this like trance-like state. So for me personally, that doesn't quite add up. Again, I don't really know much about crystal meth, so maybe I'm wrong. But from Google, it just seems like it would make you like more hyperactive, like constantly moving, not just like walking like a zombie. When the house was searched, the police found absolutely no drugs. They found absolutely no drug paraphernalia of any kind, or anything they were even slightly involved in this world of crystal meth. On top of this, friends and family insist that Sherilyn and Bobby would never have done drugs. That just wasn't the kind of people that they were. And especially they wouldn't have done it whilst raising Madison, because they were really good parents. Sure, they were a bit quirky, a bit kooky, but that was just the way they were, and they loved their daughter and they were raising her. And even if they potentially didn't like each other, they both loved their daughter. Some speculate that the brown briefcase that was put into the truck was actually full of drugs and all their paraphernalia, but we'll never know for sure because the brown briefcase has never been found. The only thing I'm pretty sure of is I don't think it was full of money. It's highly unlikely that they would have a briefcase full of money and all of the money under the seat as well. But authorities do think it was money, so I mean, my opinion doesn't really matter, that's just what I think. But then perhaps that would make sense if somebody knew that they were going up to the mountains with a briefcase full of money. Maybe they would follow them up there and murder them and take the briefcase, not realising there was so much more money stuffed under the seat. But let's say for the theory's sake that they were indeed drug users. They head up to the mountains under the guise of looking at this plot of land they want to move to, but instead they had actually arranged a drug deal. Either buying or selling. I'm inclined to potentially believe that they might have been selling because it would help with their financial situation, which once again brings the brown briefcase into play because it would be full of the drugs they were selling. It would explain why they left the dog in the car, because why would they take a dog with them to a drug deal, but it doesn't explain why on earth they would bring their 6-year-old daughter with them. That doesn't make sense. Especially when there were so many people, they had so many friends, so much family who would have been more than happy to babysit Madison. So it makes no sense they would want to bring her up into the mountains for a drug deal, unless they thought that maybe having a child with them would make them less likely to be hurt in any way. But again, there's no proof whatsoever that they had anything to do with drugs in the first place. So for this next theory, I suppose I can't really talk about theories without mentioning the supernatural, a possible paranormal connection. I wouldn't say I'm particularly one for believing in the supernatural, so this is something I find hard to talk about as like a legitimate theory and a viable reason for their deaths. But I know some people do believe in this stuff, and maybe some of you do think that it's a valid theory. So if you do, I would really like you to like expand on this down below. Obviously they thought their house was haunted. Whether it actually was or not isn't relevant. They thought it was. But these random spirits wouldn't have followed them up the mountains to murder them. I mean, that's not how spirits and the supernatural works. So I'm not saying they were murdered by these spirits, but I am saying this could have possibly affected their mental state so much they could have gone up to the mountains and done this themselves, killed themselves. Maybe it like really affected their brains. They maybe started to like hear things, see things, which leads us on to our next theory, which is the theory of a murder-suicide. Now this is definitely the most popular theory in this case, but it still has its holes and relatives heavily dispute it. And there is no denying that both Bobby and Sherilyn had their problems. Bobby had his severe back pain, he couldn't work, he could barely even move a lot of days. He was heavily medicated and this probably would have affected his mental state as well. Alongside this, he was convinced that there was spiritual warfare going on in his home. Sherilyn suffered with severe bipolar disorder and depression, and it doesn't seem like she was taking her medication properly. Her son said that she seemed to be in a pretty bad place when he left. And there are also signs pointing to their marriage potentially being in trouble as well. I mean, the 11-page letter with Sherilyn expressing her hatred for Bobby would probably show that they weren't that happy. But according to friends and family, Sherilyn's bipolar would often make her angry and spiteful, which is probably the mindset she was in when she wrote the letter. All it can speak to is the state she was in at the time and not her general opinion of her marriage. But I can't imagine that their marriage was easy by any means. They would have really had to have worked to be with each other, I think, especially considering everything that went on in their lives. I mean, was their attempt to move to the mountains just a way to potentially save their marriage? I mean, this is something people do on the regular. Instead of actually dealing with the issues in your marriage, you just move house, you renovate, you have a child. Like, that is a pretty normal thing to do. Was that what the Jamisons were doing as well? But the murder-suicide theory goes that either Sherilyn or Bobby took the family out to the mountains that day with the sole intention of murdering them and committing suicide. This would explain why the truck was pulled over, why it was locked, why the gun wasn't found in the truck, but it doesn't explain why they would leave the dog in the car. I mean, if you know that you are going off to commit suicide and murder the rest of them, you don't leave the dog in the car, you let it out at least so it has a fighting chance. I mean, I know their mental states weren't ideal, but it just seems like a little bit of an odd move to make. And this theory also doesn't explain the missing brown briefcase either. Like I mentioned, the gun was never found at the scene, but of course in the years that the bodies were lying there, over 4 years, it's very likely that an animal could have picked the gun up and moved it elsewhere. I mean, that's a very valid theory. A lot of people do suspect that it was Sherilyn who was the one who murdered her family because of her bad mental state. But of course it could have been Bobby as well. But another small but significant point is that Bobby did have his bad back pain and he struggled to walk for long distances, especially walking 2.7 miles away from the truck through the wilderness. I mean, I've got a bad back, I have a spinal fusion. I struggle to sort of walk over sort of like uneven terrain. I don't have that kind of like balance. So I can't imagine that Bobby would have found it particularly easy either. Obviously, if this theory is true, then one of them must have been in a very bad state to do this. I mean, to even imagine killing your spouse is evil, but to kill your 6-year-old daughter, that's just another level. But it could point to the mental state that they were in at the time. But again, this is still not really a valid theory because there are so many different variables. The way their bodies were all lined up doesn't quite match up with this theory for me either. I mean, yeah, whoever did this, Sherilyn or Bobby, may have killed the 2 others and then lied next to them to commit suicide, but it just doesn't make sense that they would lie face down and then shoot themselves in the back of the head. Like, that's an awkward angle to do it. I mean, it makes sense if 2 of the bodies were lined up and the 3rd one was found a little bit further away if this theory was valid, but for me, that's just a big thing here. Sorry, I feel like I'm mentioning my own opinion, like my own thoughts and feelings way too much in this case, but I don't know, when you're talking about theories like this, there's just certain things that don't make sense to me, but maybe it'll make sense to you. So yeah, sorry, I do try and usually stay a little bit less opinionated. And then there's another theory, cults. And this is basically a theory that they'd got involved with some kind of cult before their deaths, and that was basically what led to their deaths. Sherilyn's best friend Nikki claimed that she was contacted by an anonymous woman who claimed that Sherilyn had been involved in this cult called the United White Knights. And apparently this cult had a hit list and the Jamisons were on this list. As this just comes from Nikki, I would take it with a pinch of salt. There isn't really much to back this up. Not saying that Nikki never like received this call, potentially she did, but who's even saying that the anonymous woman on the other end was telling the truth? They could just made it up completely. As I've mentioned in this video multiple times, and as you probably know, the family were a little bit quirky. Sherilyn was really involved in the supernatural, Wicca and witches and all of that. So who's to say she wouldn't be intrigued by something like a cult? I mean, I find Wicca fascinating myself. It's not something that I like potentially believe in. It's not something that I won't ever become a witch. But it's something that I find really fascinating to learn about. And same with cults. I find cults really, really fascinating. And Sherilyn could have felt exactly the same. So maybe she went up to the mountains to meet someone from this cult. Maybe she wanted to sort of introduce the whole family to it. Exactly why this cult would want the family dead is a mystery to me. All I can assume is that Sherilyn probably pissed them off in some way. And weirdly enough, this is the theory that friends and family of the Jamisons believe in the most. Like, this is what Sherilyn's mum is convinced happened. But I was actually able to find quite little basis in this. It's all just like hearsay, what Nikki says, this anonymous woman says. And as far as I know, in the house as well, the police found no evidence of them being involved or contacted by any kind of cult either. And then the final theory I'm going to talk about is possibly the most boring one of the lot, I want to say, that they got lost in the wilderness and died of natural causes. I mean, this happens all the time to so many different people. But it's the circumstances leading up to it which don't feel quite right here. Bobby could barely walk with his back pain, like I said. Their phones and their GPS were left in the car along with their dog. If you go out on a walk, you're going to take your dog with you, you're going to take your phones with you, and you'll definitely take your GPS with you just in case you get lost, which makes me think that they got lost intentionally. I mean, they'd clearly already been out of the phones with their car at some point, at which point Bobby had taken the photo of Madison, but they'd then returned to their cars, put their phones in there, and then decided to go out for another walk without their technology. I mean, I know some people like the idea of being technology free for a little bit, but if you're going for a walk in the wilderness with your 6-year-old daughter, you want to make sure you're safe. This theory, the natural death theory, does kind of line up with how their bodies were found, all lined up. Maybe they were like huddled together. I think Madison was found in the middle from what I could gather, but I'm not 100% sure about that. So it would make sense that Madison would be in the middle and like being like hugged by her parents to keep warm, potentially. I mean, maybe they all died huddled up during the night, maybe hypothermia, the mountains get very cold and they didn't have their coats on them. But I just don't think they would have all died at the same time on the same night. But it's definitely a possibility, but it just seems a little bit unlikely. I mean, some of them probably would have lived longer than others. I saw some people online speculate this is a case of folie à deux. Sorry, my French is shocking. I'll put it on the screen. It basically means madness of two. Maybe one of them managed to convince the other, talking about Sherilyn and Bobby, that something bad was happening. Perhaps they were being followed, needed to leave in the truck, and they just needed to get out of there as quickly as possible. And then they're driving up the mountain and the other says to the other one, like, we need to pull over, we need to walk, we're being followed. And they just walk in too far and they get lost. I mean, this is something that happens. Madness of two is an actual thing. I have another case to speak about in the next couple of months probably, which focuses strongly on this phenomenon. It's really, really interesting. It's basically a shared psychosis in which symptoms of delusional belief and sometimes hallucination are literally transmitted from one person to another. It sounds crazy, but it's genuinely something that can happen. Perhaps in this case, Sherilyn was struggling with her mental health, her bipolar, and Bobby was particularly weak and susceptible due to his pain, due to the medication he was on. It sounds a bit crazy, but maybe it's crazy enough to be the only solid explanation in this case. Sherilyn thought they were being followed. Or like even Bobby, it could have been Bobby because he was clearly in a very fragile state because he was convinced there was spiritual warfare going on in his home. I think this would explain most things, not everything, but most. I think I'm actually going to leave it here because this case is such a rabbit hole. I could literally keep talking for hours on this case. There is so much to talk about. But if I don't stop now, I don't think I'll ever stop. I cannot wait to hear what you guys think of these theories. If any of you can expand on the supernatural theory, then that'd be great. I just didn't want to like talk about it too much. I don't really know what I'm talking about when it comes to that kind of stuff. And I'm sure that some of you have so much more knowledge about the supernatural than I possibly could even begin to share. So expand on the theories. Let me know if there are things that you don't think quite add up. If there's anything you think I missed. Let me know. Thank you so much for watching. Make sure you subscribe to my channel and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.